This is going to be a little bit of a different thing than normal because, frankly, I felt like doing a full rumination over a game like Reaper of Souls was not something that was really feasible. I do have a few things to talk about, of course, with regards to the story and the analysis thereof, but only a few. So I've decided I was going to go ahead and put all the things I do have to ruminate about this game towards the end. But since it was so widely requested that I go ahead and do a video about Reaper of Souls, and since the stream was rather well received, I decided I was going to go ahead and kickstart my new concept of the recommendations thing. Now, let's go ahead and get this off right off the bat. Yes, I do recommend this game if you like games like this, of course. If you don't, then obviously there's nothing I can do for you. But if you do, I do recommend Reaper of Souls, otherwise it wouldn't say recommendations. I guess it would be down there. Regardless, let's go ahead and get the bad out of the way right now, right off the bat. There's two really major negative parts about this game. Point one. I know a lot has been said about this. I even talked about this in my Diablo 3 video. I don't really feel like there's a lot else to be said other than a couple of points. But the always online requirement is still kind of irritating. The lack of land support is still kind of irritating. The fact that they are basically requiring you to do that is kind of irritating. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to tell you that that has destroyed my enjoyment of the game or indeed affected my enjoyment of the game at all, to be completely honest. But I do know several people who are playing solo games just by themselves who can't enjoy playing their single player game as much because there's latency because it has to be online, which is frustrating. I'm just going to toss at you two examples here really quick. For example, let's say you have internet issues for whatever reason and you want to take your mind off of things. So you go ahead and pull up a video game. Well, Diablo 3 is not going to be on that list because it requires online to play your single player game. And another example of this is they do server maintenance semi regularly, which they should, I might add. Speaking as someone who used to do server maintenance as his job, that is something you need to keep up on. But while the servers are down for maintenance, you can't play. You get where I'm going with this. I can't say it ruins the game for me, but I also cannot speak positively about it. So that is a definite negative about it, and it remains a negative about it. The other big negative is the party size problem. Again, I mentioned this before. It's not really the same issue as it was previously because not as many people I know are playing Diablo 3 right now. But the 4-player party limit size is. It feels incredibly arbitrary. I've since done some looking into why there is such a small party size limitation, and there are actual reasons for it, most of them technical in nature, but I feel like they could expand that to, I'd say probably about 6, maybe 8, without too much of a hassle, but at the same time, I do kind of get where they're going from it. It's another kind of a gray area situation, but it is definitely a negative regardless. Now, if you're expecting me to... Well, there is one last negative, but I'm actually going to save that because that's not with the game. That's a... Well, I mean, it is with the game, obviously, because everything's about the game. But point is, I'm going to save that for the rumination section, which will be later. Let's talk about the new class, the Crusader. Now, the Crusader is tons of fun. Tons of fun. It is pretty much all of the aspects of Paladin from Diablo 2 and WoW, cranked up to 11, given a great deal of more flair and style, and then shoved out and said, here, go be awesome. Seriously, Crusaders are really cool, really fun to play. You can set up your Crusader as a full-on glass cannon, or glass hammer, I guess, kind of a situation. You can set up your Crusader as a full-on tank, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. You can set them up as someone who is very reactive. They can be extremely situationally helpful. They can be really good at AoE. They can be really good at single target. There's a lot of variance in the Crusader gameplay, so they really did a good job in making the class fun to play and still making it so that it has a variety of options for how you want to play it. The other thing I want to talk about, though, with regards to Crusader really quick here, is something that they kind of did previously with Barbarian and Monk, but I feel they succeeded better at with Crusader. With Crusader, you can actually play Crusader as a full-on tank. Now, that may not sound as weird to you as it did to me when I first realized it, but the truth is, playing a tank class in a non-MMO environment, in a roguelike, basically, is certainly an interesting concept in its own right, but works better than you'd think it would. especially if you're playing with friends, but even if you're not, the ability to just kind of survive. For those of you who are not familiar with the terminology, a tank is a type of class or individual within a game, usually multiplayer, which has the ability to endure, either through health or avoidance or simply having tons of armor and being able to reduce the amount of damage they take, and the ability to focus the attention of enemies upon them specifically. A good example of this is actually Dragon Age, which is a full-on single-player game where you could actually set up certain characters as specifically as tanks. But like I said, it works really well. Even if you're playing solo, the ability to just kind of live through whatever you're going through while you and your companion slowly work your way through the enemies works pretty well, actually, and involves more skill than I would have thought, given the severe reaction and quick pace of the Diablo 3 combat in general. When you're in a group, it works amazingly. Being able to focus all the enemy's attention on you at once. Obviously, there's lots of other damage that's going around. Freaking arcane sentries. But regardless, so much of it is focused on you that they can focus a little bit more on DPS, and that is a ton of fun. Granted, I am kind of a tank guy. I always have been. You can ask anybody who knows me or has played any multiplayer game with me. But regardless, definitely recommend checking it out. Let's go ahead and talk about one thing that I also like. Speaking of party size, speaking of multiplayer, they have added a few encouragement features for playing this game multiplayer, which is good because, a cooperative should kind of be a thing in a roguelike in general and in a Diablo in specific. Just give us land play. The best and most obvious thing I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now is the loot multiplier. If you are within range of another player on the multiplayer map, they will, simply being there grants you and them a buff that increases your experience, your gold find, and your magic find. In other words, it's better everything, put simply. Now, this is a good change because one of my more minor yet extant complaints from original Diablo 3 was the fact that, other than the fact that if you're all in one, every additional person who joins the thing makes the enemies a little bit harder, which also buffs up their loot drop by a very small amount, okay? It does do it, but the point is it basically makes it harder, and that's the only really noticeable change. But other than the increase to the loot drop thing in general because of the harder difficulty, there was no real reason to actually group with anyone, just to be in the same game with other people. Now that this buff aura exists, there's actually a lot more reason to go ahead and group with people because simply by being nearby, you are giving them greater loot drops and experience and all that, and of course they are to you as well. In fact, it's actually become kind of a practice for myself and some of my friends to ask someone to hop on and just kind of follow them around, even if they're not really actually playing, because of that reason. And of course, we also power leveled the crap out of several characters in basically that exact same format, because, you can do that and just kind of drag them around, etc., etc. But it's a nice little touch. Let's go ahead and talk about, as well, the new difficulties. Now, they are approaching the difficulty curve a little bit differently than they did in the past. Previously, it was like Act 1 through 4, normal difficulty. Then once you completed that, you could unlock, I believe Nightmare was next, and then Hard, or whatever it was, Hell difficulty, and then Inferno difficulty. And you had to beat the previous one to unlock the next one. Now difficulty is an option, a toggle, if you will, where you literally just go ahead and say, I want to play on normal difficulty, and I don't remember what they all are, but I know it's like normal, hard, expert, master, I want to say, and then of course torment. We'll get to that in a moment. Point is, it is now fully optional. It is now fully something you could just set up on the fly. It's something you can change on the fly too. Obviously, you want to make sure you're at a checkpoint before you hop out of the game and change the difficulty, but you can change the difficulty in incremental steps while in the game, live, so to speak, dynamically, which is really awesome. All of this is awesome for two huge reasons, okay? Reason one, and this is absolutely adamantly important, this is the single most important thing that every video game of every type ever should have, in my opinion, and that is options. The difficulty is fully optional. If you are the kind of person who wants to play an easy, fun, I want to destroy everything in my path, stress relief video game, bam, put it on normal difficulty. If you're someone who wants to be challenged but not too hard, you don't want to stress or strain over it, you just want to have something that's giving you a bit of a difficulty, well, the difficulty you'll set it at is variable. I'll talk about that in a minute. You can turn it up. If you want to get the best loot, or if you want to really challenge yourself, or you want to really push yourself, you can crank it all the way up to the torment range, etc. It is optional. And the best part is, because you can change it on the fly, if you happen to not be in the mood for torment that day, you can just crank it right back down. Just like that. If I happen to pop in, it's like, I don't feel like spending 3 minutes per boss fight. I can just turn it right back down if I feel like it. Or if I get too bored with that, I can turn it right back up. Options are good. Take note, game developers. Now let's talk about how the difficulties work a little bit. It changes everything stat-wise amongst the enemy. There's something else to talk about this here. It's called scaling, but I'll get to that in a moment. It changes everything stat-wise of the enemies. It doesn't really change the way their AI works or anything along those lines. So don't think that's going to happen. In all honesty, I think that's actually a good thing. But the reason I think that's a good thing is because having to program different AI scripts for the quadrillion enemies and enemy types that exist in this game for the 5 or 6 or however many difficulties would have been insane. What it does change, there's no penalty per se. You will still level and get good loot, even on normal difficulty. However, each difficulty increase you do will give you increased gold drop, increased magic find, and increased experience, just like everything else. There are hard caps to some of these, not experience, but gold find and magic find do reach a point in which they cap, which is worth noting because at certain points, really, there's no reason to go past a certain difficulty, especially if a full group of 4, except for the one other little tidbit. The moment you hit Torment difficulty, basically being on Torment unlocks what I'm going to just call another possibility in the loot table. It's actually kind of convoluted the way they do it. I agree with it. But basically, certain kinds of drops will not drop unless you're on one of the Torment difficulties. Now let's talk about one other thing, too, because this is really important. The enemies in the entire game, stat-wise, scale to the level of the host of the game. In other words, if you're playing by yourself and you're level 13, it is a level 13 game. You could be fighting Malthael right at the end of the game or the very first zombie right at the beginning, and they're still going to be level 13. It scales to you. But there is something that's worth noting about this. One, that's dynamic. The moment the game level changes, which changes based on whoever hosts the game, the moment you hit level 14, everything is now level 14. The moment you ding, they do too. Now, that's actually kind of cool. I'm totally with that. It means that you can go through the whole game low level or high level or whatever, and it will basically always be some kind of a challenge. But 2 really important things to note about this. Number 1, if you're going through and you have... how do I put this? If you're going through the whole game and you suddenly find yourself just having issues... Well, let's just say that the only thing that is scaled with this scale thing is the stats, which makes sense, right? The health, the damage, the armor, the resistances, all that fun stuff, all the actual numbers. As I mentioned, the AI isn't changed. The type of patterns of attacks aren't changed. So, yes, a level 70 zombie is going to hit you like a level 70, but a level 70 zombie moves slowly and does only 1 melee attack at a time. Compare that to as soon as you jump into Act 2, you see those damn wasps, which shoot those little wasp guys. Every single one of those little wasp bullets is going to hit you the same as that zombie did, and going to be harder to dodge. And so forth and so on. You get my point. My point is, even though it scales to you, the game still does get more difficult as you go on, simply because the patterns and styles of attacks get more complicated. Which, again, I think is a good thing. I just think it's worth noting. The other thing to note is that the scaling thing is pretty much fully linear up to level 69. The moment you hit level 70, it takes a sharp jump up. Believe it or not, I'm actually in favor of this, because it's fully for an endgame type mentality. The idea is the moment you're 70, the moment you're the level cap, you are now in the endgame officially, and now all the enemies are scaled not to you being a fresh 70, but to the idea of a 70 who has some gear, who has made some progression in their in their existence. And it's going to be a little bit more difficult early on, but it's not going to be impossible. And of course, you can always lower the difficulty. I gotta have a confession to make. When I was taking my notes for this game, I had not actually played on normal difficulty yet, so I didn't actually know what it was like. Prior to actually recording this now, I fired up the game and played around on normal difficulty. Normal difficulty is nowhere near as easy as casual was over on StarCraft 2. But it's still pretty easy. So yeah, if you're having issues, you can just crank it right back down, get some gear, get some stuff. The moment you hit 70, you basically, again, unlock a whole nother type of loot table, regardless of difficulty. And so you're probably going to gear up pretty fast. Lord knows I've seen several 70s over the past 2 weeks who have just been swimming in gear. And we're only on expert, I believe, difficulty for that. Point being, though, you need to be prepared for that cliff. Now, the thing is, the other reason I like that cliff, though, is it gives you a very solid feeling of progression. When you start off, I'll get into the Paragon levels in a moment, which is part of the progression. But when you start off, your relative enemy difficulty is right about here, right? And you're right about here. But as you get gear and as you get Paragon levels, which I'll talk about in a moment, you kind of start outpacing them. And it gets to the point where you start trashing everything like crazy. Well, if you want to keep progressing, you do the logical thing. You bump the difficulty up a bit. And then you do this thing, right? It gives a feeling of you actually continuing to get stronger and better in a similar way that it, basically should, even after you hit the level cap, and I like that. Let's talk about Paragon levels. Paragon levels is kind of a merging of several systems that existed prior to 2.0. Basically, it's a continued level system after levels, but rather than you just getting, another level, some new abilities, and some stats, you gain a point. For all intents and purposes, you might as well think of these as talent points. There's 4 trees. This is your first Paragon level, your second Paragon level, your third Paragon level, your fourth Paragon level, and then 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, etc., all the way up to, I believe, 800 is the current maximum that is commented on. Although, according to some reports, you can actually keep going past 800, but there's only 800 points total in these 4 trees to spend in, so it doesn't matter at that point. If you're paying attention, yes, that means there is tons of continued progression in Paragon levels. Now, this is important. And again, I agree with this design choice. The enemies do not scale to your Paragon level. Once you are at 70, they're not going to scale up anymore. Now, you can increase the difficulty, but they will not actually scale to, 70 plus 40 Paragon or whatever. So again, it gives you that feeling of progression, of slowly getting stronger than everything else around you. In addition to that, the Paragon things themselves, as I mentioned, are talent points that you can spend. These are a few important things to remember. You can refund them instantly, on the fly, and for free. Just completely respec instantly without issue, which is good. Second thing to note, each point is not really that impressive. An additional 0.1% chance to crit, or an additional 1% crit damage, or an additional, however many. Some of the numbers are variable based on your stat and your class and your abilities, but an additional 5 intellect, not a huge thing. But again, you can get a lot of these points, and you are actually supposed to get a lot of these points. The idea is to encourage you to keep progressing. So when you have an additional 600 intellect, or no, not 600, it'd be 250, another 250 intellect, that's a little bit more worthwhile, if you see what I mean. So I like that. The other most important thing about the Paragons, absolutely the most important thing, this is such a great idea, is the fact that the Paragon system is account-based, not character-based. Now, that is hugely alt-friendly. I'll talk about why in a moment, but the idea here is if you have one character you've gotten to max, which is actually true with me, I've only pushed one guy to 70, my wizard. Pushed my wizard to 70, walked around, I'm at Paragon level 50, I think I just hit 50 today, and that means I have 50 talent points for my Paragon levels to put onto any character, including my level 5 Witch Doctor. Which means that now when I go along on that Witch Doctor, I can enjoy all the benefits of having put all that time and effort into the account without having to repeat itself. It's not busy work, it's not grind work, because I experience those benefits, not just on the character I did them at, but on any other future characters I want to do in the future, which again is extremely alt-friendly. The fact that gear can so easily be tossed into the bank and used on further alts once you've gotten them, another example of alt-friendliness. There's several examples of that. The fact that the bank is automatically account-based, for example. The fact that achievements are account-based. There's a lot of account-based things. I don't want to go all over it, but the point is the game is actively trying to encourage you not to just focus on one character, but to encourage you to say, hey, you want to try that new class out? It might be fun. Crusader, I'm just saying, it's freaking awesome. But you don't want to be Witch Doctor because they just fling spiders, and that's just gross, which is why my Witch Doctor is level 5. Point being, the Paragon system is absolutely awesome. Now, let's go ahead and talk about... Let's talk about the specs next. One of the things they did in 2.0 and in Reaper in general was they completely rebalanced basically everything as far as the specs, abilities, etc. of the classes. Whether that was needed or not is debatable because they kind of... When Diablo 3 first came out, the specs were not very well balanced. The intent in mind was to make it so that any given ability and any given glyph for that ability had a use. There was nothing that was wasted. There was nothing that was never an automatic, you must have this. And there was never anything that was an automatic, you must never have this because it was too good or too bad, respectively. That was the design intent, and I applaud them on that because I like that design philosophy personally. They didn't quite succeed, but I do have to give them credit because over the last year or however long, they've basically been constantly retuning those abilities. Anytime they see one ability that's just too strong, rather than just nerfing it like most companies would do, they would nerf it and then buff the alternatives to make them look more appealing in addition to making the good one look less appealing. That's good design philosophy in a nutshell. Not all the time that they did that. But when 2.0 came out, they kind of did just a complete super revamp. Now, some of you might be asking, well, why didn't they just do that earlier? It's actually kind of hard to explain to someone who's never worked in development, but the point is, in order to do sweeping changes like that, for a lot of different reasons, you generally want to save that for a major content patch, which is usually an expansion. So I fully understand them saving such sweeping, widespread changes to every class for an expansion. It makes sense to me. That being said, everything I've seen is positive, absolutely everything. I cannot speak personally for Witch Doctor. It's the only class I can't speak personally of. All my other classes I've fiddled around with. However, I do know a friend who's played Witch Doctor who says it's pretty awesome, so props there. But what they did was one of the things the other reason they had to save this for an expansion is they kind of changed how a lot of the loot suffixes and affixes worked. Those of you who've played Diablo 3 probably know about how attack haste and health on hit, that whole thing worked before, and it just kind of became ludicrously overpowered to the point of being the only way to really progress in Inferno, blah, 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 blah. That's basically gone. So they had to buff up a lot of live capacity in the abilities for the various classes, and they wanted to give more of a flavor to them. Now, I could talk to you at length about the various classes. I'm just going to give you one little slice of that from my personal experience of the Wizard at level 70 with my builds. Now, I'm kind of a tinkerer when it comes to builds. It's one of the things I always liked about Magic the Gathering and Guild Wars, to use two of my favorite examples. The fact that you can constantly just tinker and play and come up with a new build, and you know, there's this ability that seems kind of worthless, but I bet under right circumstances I can make it work, and you can, because, you know, Magic the Gathering and Guild Wars. Diablo 3 Reaper of Souls very much feels like that now. The entire time we were going from 60 to 70 and going through all of Act 5, I was literally every few minutes going back and fiddling with my build a little bit more, trying something else out, trying to see how this worked and how that worked and how this patterned with that and blah, 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 blah. And it's actually really awesome to have the freedom to do that. And the fact that pretty much all of these builds worked. I never abandoned a build because it didn't work. I just wanted to keep tinkering. Now, at this point in time, I think I've settled on something I really like, which brings me to my next point. They've really tried to enforce the idea of more flavor to the quote-unquote builds of the classes. The idea of really being a turret on a demon hunter, or really being a AoE or a single target thing on a barbarian. The idea of being frost or fire or arcane or lightning on a wizard, you know, etc. The idea that you can actually really focus on one or two or even three of these things at once, really adds to the flavor and the variety of playing the classes, which is a good thing. I already mentioned before in my original Diablo 3 review that playing each class felt different. That is actually more so now, and it's a good thing. So, let's go ahead and talk about enchanting. Actually, we'll talk about that in a moment, because let's go ahead and talk about the thing I'm sure most people are actually waiting for, and that is Loot 2.0, which is what they called it. Now, when they announced Loot 2.0, a lot of people were hesitant and disbelieving, myself included. We were like, oh yeah, right, you're going to just fix all the loot. They actually fixed all the loot. It's hard to really go into detail, because going into detail basically is talking about every aspect of it. They went back and rehauled the very way the loot mechanics work. And of course, the most widely spread feature, which of course everybody knows about, is the fact that they got rid of the auction house entirely. Gone. Believe it or not, I actually had lengthy discussions with people trying to explain to them why the auction house had changed the way loot mechanics worked in that game, because most people didn't understand the connection. I'm not going to go into that now, by the way, because A, I kind of already talked about that in my Diablo 3 video, and B, it's actually a long and complicated subject. But suffice it to say, with the auction house's removal, they could completely ignore that factor in generating and designing not only loot itself, but how loot is distributed. So if you play Diablo 3 Reaper of Souls, you're probably going to notice a lot more loot than you did before, and a lot more of it's going to be useful. Speaking again personally, when I picked up my Crusader and started pushing through on whatever difficulty is past hard, the third difficulty, I forget what it is. Which, by the way, I just like to point out that I could totally play. This is not bragging, by the way, but I didn't have to start on normal difficulty. I could crank it right up to the third difficulty, whatever it's called, right off the bat and just play normally without any issues, except for a few bosses. They gave me some trouble, of course, but that's good design, is what I'm trying to say. Moving on. Even playing on only the third difficulty level and just leveling up 1, 2, 3, 4, I was getting upgrades every few minutes. I mean, not huge upgrades, but the fact was it was gear that was good for me. In some cases, it was gear that was good for my class, but not my spec. In some cases, it was good for my spec. So, awesome. And in some cases, it was just kind of an across the board, all greens thing. The point is, you will get a lot more loot that you actually want with Loot 2.0. And that's because of a lot of reasons, but the biggest, most important reason is there is now a hidden feature. They actually have a term for it, forgive me for not remembering it off the top of my head, which basically does another roll. Now, anytime a loot piece is generated, there's a roll to determine what slot it is, and what, we'll call it a valuation, not evaluation, valuation that loot can have, okay? For example, if it's a two-hander, it could be a two-hander with that's designed for a caster in mind. Intellect, spell damage, or not spell damage, increased arcane damage or whatever, that kind of thing, right? Or it could be designed for a barbarian with strength, or a crusader with strength, or it can be designed with dexterity, right? This is a generalization, but you get the idea. There's a second roll that happens underneath that check, and if it's basically this is a binary roll, basically. It's about a 30% chance, give or take. But that second roll looks at your exact spec, your exact class, and says, oh, you're a Crusader, so you value, everything that's within the Crusader bracket of possibilities for loot, which not only includes Crusader-only type of items, but, strength-based items, and items with affixes that specifically increase Crusader abilities, because there's a lot of things that specifically only buff, the amount of arcane power you have on a wizard, or how much mana you have on a witch doctor, or how much damage your dragoon jump does on Crusader, etc. So that second roll that goes underneath every single loot drop will check and say, "Oh, you're a Crusader," and if it's positive, if it succeeds, you get a Crusader piece of loot, which is really awesome, actually. Now, I mentioned that 30%. That's actually closer to about 60 to 70%. We're not 100% sure of it, if it is a legendary or a set item. Legendaries and set items have a huge chance to be specifically useful for the spec of the person that IDs them. This is kind of important, because this is something I've been doing. I know several of my friends have been doing it too. Sometimes we'll get a legendary we can't actually use, or we don't want for whatever reason. It's a two-hander, and I've got a main hand, offhand thing going on, for example. So I'll either hand that off to someone else to ID, or I'll put it in the bank and have it alt ID it later, because when it's ID'd, in the case of a legendary or set item, that is the moment at which those two rolls happen. And so if I toss it off to my barbarian, it is a much higher chance that my barbarian will get the strength-based legendary he wants, whereas my wizard would get nothing that they want. It would just be another disenchant piece, right? Now, a couple other things they did really awesome with Loot 2.0. First of all, they added this concept that I've been calling orange stats. I don't know what the official term is. If you mouse over an item, it'll say, increases this, increases that, increases that, does this. Every now and again, you'll see something where the bullet point next to it is orange and filled in. Those things are all the special stuff. Now, the special stuff is hard to explain because it can be basically anything. No, really, it can be basically anything. I currently have a necklace, an amulet, that has an orange thing where anytime I manage to stun someone with lightning damage, I have a chance to summon shadowy effigies of myself which will attack alongside me. That's an orange thing. Like I said, I can't really define it. It's all the special fun stuff. Now, not everything is going to be that fantastic. Some of it's rather simple, increases damage from this specific ability you have, makes it so that all of your cold damage sources are better, that kind of a thing. But the point is, orange stuff is the fun stuff. Orange stuff is where they've really shined in Loot 2.0, in my opinion. Because they could have just gone back and revamped all the stats, revamped the way loot is distributed, revamped the enchanting, which I'll talk about in a second. All that stuff, it would have been good, but I applaud them for going the extra measure, the extra mile here, to say, no, we want to make loot more fun. And so loot is more fun. And this really shines when it comes to the legendaries and the set items, which have such a variety of stuff I can't even put into it. I'm just going to list a few things off the top of my head. My friend Pax got a two-handed axe which summons cows to attack people. I got a gauntlet recently, which has actually made me insanely overpowered. That's a lie. It's not overpowered, but it's really useful because we can now do Torment 2 as a result of that. Which makes it so that instead of slowing, my frost damage will freeze instead. Let's see. We've also got there's the shadowy effigy thing I just mentioned. There's, oh my god, there's so many things. I've seen so many different things that can happen as a result of the legendaries. Reducing the ability that CCs affect you, which is way more useful than it sounds. I don't know how many of you have encountered the elite packs where they just constantly spam frozen orbs. The fact that those only last about 0.7 seconds instead of the full 1.5 or whatever is so useful. You know, etc., etc., etc. All these things are things that are on legendaries now. A lot of the legendaries now have flavor text and names that are full-on referential humor, which has made me laugh more than once. I actually have a Green Lantern ring, for example. Seriously. And the amount of usefulness and enjoyment of those things and what they can allow you to do is just, it's through the roof. I hate to say that so casually, especially at the moment. I apologize for being generalizing about this, but really, just trust me. So many of the legendaries are awesome. But that brings me to not set items. That brings me to enchanting. Now, before you think of enchanting, if you've played WoW, don't use the term enchanting mentally unless you're making a little bit of an asterisk by it, because it's not like enchanting was in WoW. It's more like re-rolling or reforging or something like that. Because here's how it works. This is incredibly awesome. Let's say I have a piece of armor that has an increase to my intellect, an increase to my vitality, and an increase to the amount of monster experience I get per kill. Now, this is a piece of crap armor, but just bear with me. I want to make this simple for this point, okay? Now, the way the loot tables work, every type of stat that can be on a piece of loot is taken from a bracket of types of stats, okay? Now, when you go to re-enchant something, this is the cool part. Let's say I get a piece of armor that has something that increases a barbarian's ability on it, but I'm a wizard. This is the cool part. When I go to re-enchant, to reforge, whatever you want to call it, that stat, it will only pull it from the things that are specific to my class when it allows me to reforge it, because I'm the one reforging it. Now, if I put on my barbarian, same difference, okay? So, in other words, you automatically get that 30% always your benefit thing I talked about earlier. Cool. Second awesome thing about this. If you click the little question mark next to the stat, it will show you everything within that bracket it might be and the ranges it might be. Now, this is incredibly awesome for three basic reasons. One, the UI is incredibly simple, quick, easy, fun. It gets across all the information it needs to immediately, and you can see it and just go like, yes, I know exactly what I'm going to possibly get. I know exactly what the odds are. It is still a form of gambling. I'll talk about that in a moment. But at least it is very informed gambling. You know this is what you might get, including what you already have, and this is the range of what you might get. And that's the other thing. If you have something that increases your vitality by 500, and you hit that question mark, you'll see that the vitality range for an item of this level, we'll just assume 70 for the moment, is 400 to 600. So you know that your vitality of 500 is pretty much middle of the road. So you may not even want to change that to something else. You may try to enchant it and get a reroll on that, specifically to see if you can get more vitality on that, because that's feasible too. But the point is, so the information is there immediately and apparent. The second reason that's awesome is because you get to see exactly what... you get to know exactly why it is you're trying to reforge this, or rather, you know which things you want to reforge. Let's say you get something and you have a stat on it, just one stat on an otherwise great suit of armor that you don't actually like that much. So you got to reforge it. You can click that question mark and see if there's anything worth reforging into. Maybe there isn't. Maybe it's like, well, the only other things in that bracket are, you know, I could go for that or that, and maybe that's not worth your time or effort. The final reason this is really awesome is because it really adds to the random element of it. And I hate to say that, but a game like Diablo kind of lives and breathes off of its random element. Because here's what actually happens when you do a reforge. You pick that vitality, I think I keep talking about, right? Reforge it. It will then do 3 rerolls of that stat with the 30 percentile within your range within the bracket, and so it will re-roll to determine which one it picks, roll a second time, roll a third time, and then each one of those three will get another roll to determine how good it is within the range of how good it can be. And then it'll display it, and you can say, "Oh, well, that's obviously better," or "Well, that's kind of the same," or whatever. But I will pick that and go with that. Now, enchanting is a little bit of a sink in terms of money and reagents, but that brings me to my last point, and that is the fact that I don't have a better way to put this. Crafting has actually become useful again in this game. Not just because of enchanting, although enchanting is a huge reason why, but the fact that that's kind of what happens anytime you craft anything, really. If you craft a piece of armor, it will be within that 30 percentile. Well, actually, I haven't been able to verify that 100%. I heard someone talk about it might not be. It might just have the increased chance of a legendary, so it's like the 60 percentile. But either way, every time I've crafted something, it's been the it's good for you type of loot, which it should be in my opinion. It also does the random thing just like the other thing, and it will always tell you, okay, this will have 4 random suffixes. In some cases, it will have certain things that are automatically a part of it, and then it will have suffixes. And of course, you can make legendaries, and in fact, I already have most of the materials to make my first legendary right now. I'm just missing one. And the materials for that are not that uncommon as long as you do some of the new stuff in the adventure mode, which is the last thing I'm going to talk about before we get to the rumination section. The adventure mode is pretty freaking awesome if you like random dungeon crawling generated fun. That's probably the synopsis I could give there. But as usual, I want to talk about that a little bit more. The way adventure mode works, and it's kind of hard to explain because the concept is so weird when you think about it in context. Imagine if you had the ability to, oh, I don't know, teleport to any waypoint in the entire game from anywhere. Pretty much instantly. You have the entire world map of all 5 acts completely opened up freely and instantly. Okay, so you're able to go anywhere, regardless of story considerations. There are no story flags or otherwise, but events can still happen, and bosses are still there. And there's no quests per se, except there are quests. There's bounties. Now, I've seen a pretty huge variety of bounties. Bounties can be kill enemies within an area, kill a number of enemies within an area, kill a certain specific enemy in the area, clear an entire specific section. Most of them involve killing, but it's different varieties of killing, and it's usually do something within this particular area or region. When you complete a bounty, you get a gigantic boost of bonus exp, some gold, which is actually pretty big as well, and usually you get some blood shards. I'll talk about that in just a moment. When you do enough bounties, you also get one other thing. I forget what they're called, but they're like rift shards or something like that. 5 rift shards can be consumed in order to create a rift. When you hop into a rift, that's where things get interesting. But I'm going to leave rift for just a moment, because I want to talk about one other thing about adventure mode 2 that's interesting. First of all, you have to beat the game once, kill Malthael, regardless of difficulty, regardless of level, in order to unlock adventure mode. But I have also noticed that if someone else has unlocked adventure mode and you have not, you can still join their adventure mode game. I don't know if that's been patched or fixed, but that was true twice for 2 different people earlier this week, so shrug. But adventure mode is also an unlock per account. So for example, one of the things that we did was we went ahead and beat the game. I was on my wizard, he was on his wizard, I think actually. And he was on his barbarian, and we beat the game. We started up in adventure mode, and then they both bought their monks, who are not max leveled, and then we just leveled them in adventure mode because you can do that. And the total freedom combined with the increased randomness and the other thing I'll mention in just a moment kind of made adventure mode a lot of fun. And as you do the bounties themselves are incredibly lucrative. You get tons of loot and gold from it, and of course you get tons of exp, so it's pretty much the best way to both level and to Paragon level. 2 other things about bounties, and I'm leading up to this. One, if you complete all of the bounties within a given act, there's always 5 per act. If you complete all of them, you get 1 big old chest. Now this chest is the second best type of loot drop that exists in the game. If you don't know what I mean by that, just picture if this was a range of all the quality of loot that can drop at level 70 right here, right? Normal enemies are over here, elites are like over here. Well, actually, it'd be like normal enemies, chests, elites, certain types of chests, uniques, really big chests, bosses, And then way over here, the second best type of loot drop that exists is these Nephilim catches that you get for completing all the bounties within an area. You also get tons of XP and gold for completing all the bounties within an act. The other thing about adventure mode is that the density has been increased. Now, if you don't know what I mean by that, or some of you are probably like, what? No, that's in the rifts. No, bear with me. Because there's an artificial limitation on how many enemies can be made elites and or elite packs when you're playing in the story mode campaign. In adventure mode, that limitation is gone. So let's just say that it became very, very, very common for me and my friends as we're going through adventure mode to be fighting one elite pack while fighting another elite, and then occasionally, while we're still fighting these two elite groups, sometimes a third elite would roam in because there were so many of them in such a small area. Whether that's a good or a bad thing is going to depend on your opinion. I think it's a good thing for several reasons. One, it keeps it fun and interesting. Two, they give tons of XP and it's a great source of loot. And three, it was challenging, which is one of the things I like about this game, actually. Now, I mentioned the blood shards earlier. You get those from bounties, and you can get them from doing the rifts, which I'll talk about last. Blood shards are gambling. That's really all it is. It's straight up same thing as it was way back in Diablo 2. The only difference is you use blood shards instead of gold. That's it. Boom. Right there. 1-to-1. You talk to the woman. She's actually a relative of Geese. And you say, here's 5 blood shards. Give me a random shoulder piece. And she will give you a random shoulder piece. I have gotten nothing good off of all of my blood shards ever. However, it's gambling. That's how it works. That's how it worked back in Diablo 2. I do know several friends who have gotten legendaries and indeed a set piece out of gambling. So I do know that's at least possible. So, rifts. Let's talk about rifts. No, not the MMO. The way a rift works, you burn 5 things, you open a rift. Now, rifts are extremely random, to the point where if I define them other than saying they are extremely random, I'm not really doing them service. It can be a random layout of a random area anywhere from anything in the entire game, and the enemies you will fight in it are also completely random. That's probably the best way I could put it. There are also absolutely no limitations on any of the density caps for regular mobs or elite mobs, but there's also nothing increasing it like there is in adventure mode. So in general, you will have a completely random experience in a rift, which is the point. You go into a rift, you're getting a randomized dungeon crawl, which is exactly what people asked for and wanted, which is pretty much exactly what rifts are. Rifts are actually a lot of fun, and they are incredibly lucrative because I mentioned earlier that the Nephilim caches were the second best source of loot in the entire game. The first best is Rift Guardians. These are the best sources of loot in the entire game. They will drop the absolute best stuff. They are guaranteed to always drop blood shards. They have close to a 70% chance to drop legendaries, just in general. It may not always be a legendary item. Sometimes it will be a legendary crafting item. But it will. I actually have never killed a Rift Guardian and not gotten some kind of legendary off of them. Ever. And I've been doing several of them, to say the least. The way it works is you go into a rift, random enemies, random areas. Sugar magoo. And once you've killed a certain number of enemies, and it varies randomly based on the area, based on the randomization of the seed you get, basically. Once you kill a certain enough amount of enemies, a boss spawns quite literally on you. That boss is random. Yes, very good. You're getting the habit of this really quickly. Might as well just call them riftums or something, because everything about Rift is basically random except for a few key features. You get a random boss. That boss is always based off of one of the big story bosses of the game. You know, Iswal, the Arachne Queen, the Skeleton King, that kind of a thing, right? And they hit hard and they do lots of fun stuff. They have unique abilities, some of which are based on their story mode, some of which are not. I have this suspicion that I have not been able to confirm that they basically have 2 brackets of abilities. The ones that are based on the story mode and this other one. And this other one is actually random, because I've actually fought several iterations of the Skeleton King, whatever he's called. The Guardian King, I think. And he's done different stuff both times. I think it's also randomized. Wouldn't surprise me. Regardless, when you finally bring them down, and it's usually a tough fight, they drop the best loot in the game, as already mentioned, and a crap ton of XP, and then you go and turn in the quest, which also gives you a crap ton of XP and also gold. Rifts are lucrative, and they're fun. And they really add a lot of endgame life to the game, because you can just run rifts, and it's just varied enough that the gameplay itself carries any aspects of boredom away on silver wings, you know. One last thing I want to talk about before we cover into the ruminations thing. I know I said I was getting to it, but give me a moment here. They did this pretty much only with the Act 5 bosses, but all of the Act 5 bosses were what I would like to call WoW-style bosses, and I mean that in a good way. In other words, if you pay attention, most of the earlier bosses are just dodge things and do damage and try to live through stuff. Pretty standard for Diablo in general, actually. In Act 5, a lot of the bosses, if you're really paying attention, you can basically never get hit. But I don't mean that as a negative. I mean, the point is you have to be really paying attention. They have some obvious tells and some not obvious tells. The bosses encourage you to pay attention. The bosses encourage you to think about how you're fighting them rather than just standing there and face tanking them. And I like that. I like the style and the fun and the enjoyment of the new bosses. And that's all I wanted to say about that. So, rumination time. I do have a few spoilers here. Oh, sorry. Yeah, a couple spoilers here. First of all, one of the things they did in Reaper of Souls was a continuation of what they did back in Diablo 3. And that is really fleshing out the setting, the people within it, the world, the flavor. I implore you, if you care anything about the setting of the story whatsoever, and you're playing through Act 5, go into every door, read every book, talk to every person you can constantly, because there is a load, a huge tonnage of flavor and background and just fleshing out of the world that makes you actually feel like you're in a place. There's this huge subplot that happens as you're going through most of Westmark in Act 5 about the king and about his, the people who are against him and how he was actually forced into rule by the Zakarum, but it's okay because he's actually a decent guy. Even though he has to cater to the nobility, he's trying to subvert them in order to help the common folk. And then there's these people who want to get rid of him because they're common folk and he's a king and therefore they're against him. But then there's these people who want to get rid of him because they want power for themselves. And it's just this whole subplot thing that goes throughout the thing. And you're going to miss it completely if you just go through the game and do the bare minimum necessary to finish the game, you know? And there's tons of events which just flesh out. There's this, oh my god, I don't want to spoil too much, forgive me. Despite the murker earlier. But there are so many little events that just made me think about the people that lived in that place and what kind of lives they led. And, the risen again captain who was insistent on defending the house, and the woman who turned into a half-demon because of results I'm not going to talk into right now. Just so many little things. Definite props and kudos for fleshing out the world so much in Act 5. I also, I also really like the usage of the sage woman, the fortune teller, the person who can see the future, because as with all crafting people, when you recruit her about midway through Act 5, once she's recruited for your character like forever. So if you go all the way back to Act 1, she's there. The thing I like about that is they actually gave her dialogue that was relevant and prevalent as if she had always been there in the earlier acts. And they use it very specifically, because that's a tricky thing to do. Obviously, by simple definition, by having her unlocked, you already know all the events that she is predicting. So it's not like, she says something's... They could have copped out and had her say, oh my god, you will have something horrible happen to you at this point in time. And you, the player, already know that, because you've already played that section. What they actually do is they have her comment on things and ways and just add tiny little bits of lore, for lack of a better term for it, for some of the events that happen and for some of the people you interact with in the earlier acts, which is freaking awesome, if you'll forgive me for being blunt, and really well usage of that. It made me actually want to go back and replay through the earlier acts just to see what she said, and of course to see what all the other new dialogue was, because they added a lot of other additional dialogue for the earlier acts. Primarily for the Crusader, but they did add several across the board, so definite props there. Alright, I said I had a few things to truly ruminate about. Unfortunately, I only really have 3 things to ruminate about, which is why I didn't want to do a true rumination about this game. Let's talk about how disappointing the ending was. I hate to say it like that, because it wasn't actually disappointing per se. The fact that Diablo is free again is disappointing, is spoiler alert, obviously. And the reason it's disappointing is I don't know how I would have done it differently. And I know that sounds weird, but the whole thing has such a feeling of slamming the reset button. And yet, it wasn't. The more I analyze the way they executed Diablo's release, the more it makes sense, the more it actually fits perfectly. It actually adds to Malthael's character and to the general idea of where Tyrael is coming from and his character and blah, 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 blah. And so I can't actually bring myself to be upset about the fact that Diablo is now free because A, we knew that was going to happen. His name is on the series. And B, it was all in service of story, of setting, of plot, of characterization. So it's like, ugh. I just wish they hadn't gone straight from the end of Diablo 3, where Diablo is sealed away forever, to the end of Reaper Souls, where Diablo's spirit is free again. That's the third complaint I mentioned quite a while ago. You can obviously see why I saved it for here. It's kind of a spoiler. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is the path of the Nephilim. I personally don't think that Tyrael is intimating that we, the player character, are going to become just as terrible as previous enemies, even though the story itself does that. Let me tell you something that a lot of people did not notice as they were playing through Diablo 3, especially Act 5. Every time you get a quest update, as you're going through, pull up the quest log. No, seriously, do it, because there will be a little bit of a note, like a notebook thing there, and it will be written by the player character, in my case, the wizard, and her talking about her thoughts on what's happening and why it's going on. It's not a you have to go this area and kill 5 boars kind of a thing. No, it's very much here's what I'm thinking about the situation right now thing, and it really helps flesh out the player character significantly, I think. As we were going through the game, the player character started sounding more and more like the kind of person who really probably was going to leap off the deep end of evil, or at the very least, severity, pretty soon. And I kept getting more and more the impression that we were going to be the next big bad of the next game because of that alone. And it wouldn't exactly be the first time they did that, would it? Diablo 1, Dark Wander. Anyways, point being, at the end, Tyrael has this big speech about how he's not sure if, the main character will make the right choice and blah, 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 blah. I don't feel like he personally thinks the main character will become, some hideous evil like has happened before. I think he was speaking in slightly more general terms. Because what worries me most is the idea that all the people who were born after the World Stone was destroyed have the potential, or rather are, I guess I should just say it flatly, Nephilim. As time has been going on, it's actually mentioned in several lore tidbits throughout Diablo 3 Vanilla that people have been getting stronger and stronger as time gets on, and more influential, more powerful, more capable of doing things that otherwise that would have been considered out of bounds or too difficult earlier, because they're not really human in the limited sense anymore. Because the whole purpose of the World Stone, for those who missed it, well, one of the repurposed purposes of the World Stone, because there was actually several purposes of the World Stone. But anyways, point being, it was limiting humanity's potential on purpose because of an ego trip, to summarize. But the point here is that imagine a whole planet populated with people who have the potential to be more powerful than demons and angels. That's kind of a terrifying thought to me personally. Now, it is worth noting that even amongst the more powerful Nephilim of the world, we, the player characters, the Nephilim, as we're referred to throughout the games, are more powerful than your average people. It is actually mentioned as you go through Act 5 how we, the player characters, are actually getting even stronger than we were before and are just growing and growing and growing in power as these events continue and progress, which is funny because that's exactly how it felt like too in gameplay, so props for gameplay story integration there. But as it mentions that, I got the feeling that obviously we were much stronger than any other Nephilim could have aspired to be. But that's the point, that Tyrael's mention about us setting the right path and making sure that we're doing the right thing. I feel, my interpretation, is that he was intimating that we need to set the example for the future generations. We need to actually rise up and say, okay, this is how the Nephilim are going to be. This is how it's going to be. We need to actually be that beacon to help guide the Nephilim into a better future rather than proving Malthael right. And that brings me into my very last thing I want to talk about this game, and that's Malthael himself. One of the things that some people don't seem to understand about Diablo 3 is that to be an angel or to be a demon means you are bound by your nature, whatever that nature is. In other words, you don't really have freedom of will. Not really. It's actually kind of complicated and convoluted, and there have been one or two exceptions. In fact, I think there have been a grand total of five throughout the history of the series. But the point is, if you are an angel or you're a demon, you are bound to the very concept that you are most personified. Now, obviously, that applies obviously in overt ways with the mains, terror, justice, valor, etc. But that's true for all angels, all demons. It's also worth noting that all of the fates of all angels and all demons is all written in the book of Angerus or whatever. Not Angerus. They name it, but it's the book of fate. In other words, the implication here is that angels and demons will always do the same things regardless. That's where I bring up that no freedom of will thing. You put an angel in a situation, they will always, every 100% of the time, do the exact same thing no matter how many times they're put in that situation because they are bound by their nature. They are chained by it. It does not mean they are not sentient, by the way. It just means that they cannot think or function outside of their main purpose, their main focus. Nephilim can do whatever, think whatever, right? That's kind of the point, actually. We have freedom of will. We can choose ill, we can choose good, we can go back and forth. But this is all important to recognize Malthael's dilemma. Because his true binding, his aspect that he personified was not death. Even though he took upon himself the power of death thanks to the Fortress Pandemonium and a few other things. We ourselves do that throughout the course of the game too. It's not that big of a deal. That's not actually his focus. Despite portraying himself as the Angel of Death, Malthael is still bound by his original focus. He is still locked into it, and that focus is wisdom. Malthael is interesting to me because his biggest thing was he wanted humanity to die. He wanted to extinguish humanity. Now that's obvious, but he didn't want to do it about the eternal conflict. That's the excuse. That's his justification. And it became more obvious as the game went on, and when you actually hear him talking during the final battle, it's very obvious. He is using that as a full-on excuse to justify his actions, which he believes are correct, and he is bound to because it is wisdom. Which is kind of a depressing thought when you think about it, because I kind of agree with him. See, Malthael's spent years upon years journeying across Sanctuary, learning about the people, and then he spent a great deal of time in Pandemonium, where a huge amount of souls of dead humans had ended up, and learning from them, and hearing about their cries and their torments and all the things they went through in their life. Malthael believed, like any good Final Fantasy villain would, that humans didn't deserve to exist. And it's kind of hard to argue with that, really. Seeing all the horrible things that happen, not just in Act 5 where they really hammer that point in, but you go back and play back through Act 1 through Act 4 and see all the things that humans do willingly, without external influence. Yeah. I'm not going to talk any more about that concept per se, but it's interesting because Malthael's biggest thing was he believed humanity should, for the good of everything, stop existing. And he was probably right, all things considered. But he made two big mistakes. Now, this is interesting because I've heard some people say this is a plot hole, when in fact it's the exact opposite. It's actually really well designed. Malthael takes the Black Soul Stone specifically so that he can convert it into something which will absorb all demonic essence into it, right? Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense. Get rid of all the demons, eternal conflict is over. Catch is it also takes all the demonic essence from people because they're part demon, part human, so it kills all the humans at the same time. Thing is, the end of the eternal conflict thing, again, that's the excuse. He wanted to just extinguish all humanity, and he wanted to do it in a way that would benefit the angels, forever, and in his opinion, all of creation forever. Okay. But he does this. Why then does he go on a gigantic rampage to murder thousands or millions? We're not even sure. There's actually several boss fights you fight on top of a colossal room-sized pile of corpses. And I'm talking room bigger than my room. We're talking like several buildings large room of corpses. Why does he kill all those people? Now, we have a direct answer of that. He does it so he can absorb their souls and go stronger. Why? The answer is actually really obvious once you sit back and think about it. Malthael knew that he could not make any move as long as the most important and powerful rogue element in the entirety of existence still roamed around. And that's us. I don't mean the humans. I mean the Nephilim. I mean the main character. We took down the primeval, and two of the primevals prior to that. But then we took down the primeval, basically by ourselves. Yeah, that's a threat that has to be taken very seriously. So Malthael took upon himself the essence of death and became the Angel of Death, even though he was still bound by wisdom, specifically so that he could absorb all those souls, and he sent off all those people on that crusade for a twofold strike. One, because it would distract us. It would give him time not only to prepare the Black Soulstone, but to absorb more souls, which brings me to point two, killing as many humans as possible, Nephilim. Keep in mind, a lot of these were Nephilim, specifically so he could absorb their souls and grow much, much stronger as a result of that. Because he knew that no matter what he did, he could not make a move without us moving against him. And so in his opinion, he was trapped. It's actually kind of ironic, because I feel like one of the reasons he did such horrible acts so wantonly was specifically to be distracting, because he felt he had to, because he was backed into a corner in his mind. He had to wipe out humanity. He had to. But that annoying Nephilim is in the way. The player character is there, and they don't understand. So I have to do that. I have to go. I have to slaughter the innocent. I have to massacre them. I have to have all these horrible, terrible acts happen, specifically so they'll be distracted as possible, so we can kill as many as possible, so I can get all their energy to myself, so that when, not if, when the player character comes after me, I can at least be ready for them. And that is why he was doing all that. And I find it fascinating because we learn a lot about his character based on that. I mentioned earlier, similarly, the level... I mentioned, okay, I talked about how he feels backed into a corner. I talked about how he's the cornered, trapped animal thing. One of the things he does in the middle of the fight with him is he summons the Black Soulstone, which, as we speak, is actively doing its purpose of destroying everything. He summons it to himself and absorbs the essences of the seven, nine, of the primevals into himself, so that he can then use that power directly against us. Okay. Obviously, that's how Diablo escapes, by the way, if you didn't actually catch that. But again, I'm okay with it because A, it services the story, and B, it really speaks to his character and how far he's gone at this, how, again, backed into a corner he really feels. He realized in that moment that we were going to stop him, and once we did, we'd just go stop the Black Soulstone and be over. So in his sheer and psychotic levels of desperation, he felt the only thing he could do to ensure that he did this was to draw that energy directly into himself, to take upon himself the primevals, so that he could defeat the only thing that could stop him, us, and then proceed with the extermination of humanity, because it has to happen. It has to. And the level, oh my god, I don't even have words for how desperate an act that had to have been for him. And it really fleshes out his character, and it really made the final boss fight just absolutely epic and awesome. I gotta give some applause, because the Malthael fight was really, really well done. Even the whole last dungeon in the Pandemonium Fortress felt like something out of a Final Fantasy, and I mean that in a good way, you know, the old Final Fantasy, because it felt like last dungeon material. It felt epic. It felt awesome. And without wishing to spoil too much, let's just say that the events that happen as you go through the Pandemonium Fortress actually change based on which class you are, which is pretty freaking awesome. But that's everything I have to say about Diablo 3 Rebirth of Souls. I hope you enjoy. We'll see if I do any more of these in the future. I'm really tired right now. I'm actually going to go to bed as soon as I finish recording this. So, have a good one, guys. See you on the flip side.